What if the love you're holding on to isn't love at all, but fear wearing the mask of familiarity? What if the relationship that keeps you awake at night, the one that tightens your chest and slowly tears at your mind, is not your destiny, but your distraction? Be honest with yourself. Are you staying because it's real, or because you're terrified of starting over? We tell ourselves that endurance is strength, that loyalty means sacrificing our peace, that staying silent makes us mature, noble, patient. But silence isn't always patience. Sometimes it's self-abandonment. Stoicism doesn't teach you to feel nothing. It teaches you to see clearly. And clarity is painful when you've been pretending. What about the feelings you keep forcing? The hope you keep manufacturing? The version of them you keep protecting, just to avoid facing what's real? This isn't about when to leave. It's about why you already know it's time. Deep down, you do. They always say the right words, at the perfect moment. It sounds sincere. It sounds like growth. It feels like change. But the truth, you've heard it before. You've walked this emotional loop so many times. You could trace it blindfolded. One tearful apology, one vulnerable promise, one late night conversation that feels like a breakthrough. For a moment, you believe it. For a moment, it feels different. And then a week later, you're explaining your pain all over again. As if it never counted. As if your tears were temporary. As if your honesty expired. You're not stuck because you don't understand. You're stuck because a part of you still hopes. You still believe. This time the apology is real. This time they mean it. This time they truly see you. But patterns don't lie. Patterns aren't emotional. They aren't confused. They aren't temporary. They are consistent. And consistency is truth. Patterns don't change because you want them to. They repeat. Again and again. Until they are confronted. Or until you finally walk away. Here's the hard truth. Patterns reveal the person. Not their intentions. Not their words. Not their potential. Their repeated choices. Especially when things get difficult. Show you exactly who they are right now. If someone disappears when you're vulnerable, raises their voice when they feel exposed, changes the subject when you speak your truth, that isn't a flaw waiting to be fixed. It's a pattern. And a pattern is a quiet confession. It tells you what they truly value. It tells you how much effort they're willing to give. It tells you how much responsibility they can actually hold. The mistake we make, we think patterns are temporary obstacles. We convince ourselves that if we love harder, wait longer, explain better, sacrifice more, they'll change. But love does not heal someone who refuses to look at themselves. And staying does not transform someone who benefits from your tolerance. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that what you're holding on to is not love. It's fear of being alone. And loneliness is lighter than carrying a relationship that slowly erases you. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself in the compromises you shouldn't have made, in the silence you forced, in the boundaries you kept lowering. The truth is, you already know. You feel it in your body, in the exhaustion, in the overthinking, in the way your joy feels muted. The question isn't, is it time? The question is, how much longer will you negotiate with pain just to feel wanted? But that belief, it's a trap. It isn't hope. It's self-neglect dressed up as romance. The moment you realize that patterns speak louder than promises, something shifts inside you. You start paying attention differently. You stop listening to their explanations and start watching their behavior. You stop holding on to apologies and begin observing habits. How do they treat your silence? Do they grow curious about your distance? Or do they fill the quiet with assumptions? How do they respond when you're hurting? Do they lean closer with empathy? Or pull away with frustration? How do they react to your boundaries? Do they respect them? Or push just enough to maintain control? These are the small, quiet signals people reveal about themselves every single day, but we miss them. When we're hypnotized by potential, it isn't cruel to accept someone as they are. In fact, it's one of the kindest things you can do for them and for yourself. Because the longer you stay with someone, based on who they might become, the more of yourself you sacrifice to a version of them that may never exist. You begin editing your needs just to avoid conflict. You shrink your truth to protect their ego. You slowly become a version of yourself who tolerates what you once cried over. That isn't growth. That's erosion. And sometimes the only way to stop losing yourself is to finally acknowledge what their pattern has been whispering all along. This is who they are. Carl Jung once said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." And when that truth truly lands, not just understood, but believed, you stop waiting for people to transform into someone else. You stop handing out endless chances to the same wound. You stop confusing patience with self-abandonment, because at some point, continuing to stay hopeful in the face of repetition becomes denial. You don't have to hate them. You don't need a dramatic exit, but you do need to ask yourself, what is it costing you to keep circling a truth you already feel? Sometimes the hardest thing isn't leaving someone who hurt you. It's leaving someone who keeps promising they won't, because that promise carries just enough light to make you question the darkness you're living in. But life was never meant to be lived in that in-between. You were not designed to survive on crumbs of connection, and the relationship you're in should never require you to abandon yourself just to keep the peace. Pay attention to what keeps repeating. Pay attention to how it makes you feel. Your body knows. Your gut knows. Your silence knows. And deep down, a part of you has known for a long time. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." If your thoughts are always anxious, always guarded, always trying to decode someone else's inconsistency, your soul will absorb that chaos. But when your thoughts begin to shift, when they root themselves in truth, in boundaries, in clarity, your soul begins to calm again. You don't need a louder sign than that. You just need the courage to trust it, because the pattern isn't going to change unless they want to change. But your life, that can change the moment you decide to. Stop waiting. Love shouldn't feel like something you have to survive. It shouldn't leave you exhausted before you even speak. If you find yourself rehearsing every sentence, softening your tone just to keep the air from cracking, you're not speaking freely. You're bracing. Your nervous system is working overtime, just to keep you emotionally safe, in a space that was supposed to protect you. When being near someone starts to feel like walking through a minefield, you're no longer in love. You're in survival. And the most dangerous part, most people don't even realize it. It creeps in slowly. A raised voice here, a guilt trip there, silence used as punishment. Over time, your peace becomes a memory, and anxiety becomes the default. But you tell yourself it's normal. You tell yourself every relationship has problems. You convince yourself this is what love requires. But love doesn't steal your breath, only to suffocate you. It isn't meant to cost you the very thing that keeps you grounded, your inner calm. You were never meant to shrink in someone else's presence. And yet, day by day, you make yourself smaller, more agreeable, less expressive, all in the name of not starting something. But in doing that, you've already started something else. The slow erosion of your voice. And once your voice begins to disappear, everything else follows. Your needs, your joy, your sense of self. You go through the motions. You smile when expected. You show up out of habit, but inside, it's quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that screams softly in the background, asking why you keep betraying yourself just to hold on to something that isn't holding you back. It's a quiet kind of disappearing. No one is pushing you out. You're slowly walking away from your own reflection. Every time you choose tension over truth, it's not that they hit you. It's not that they screamed. It's that you can't remember the last time you felt safe enough to simply be. That matters. Peace is not a luxury. It's the baseline. It's the ground beneath love, not the reward for enduring it. Any connection that requires you to abandon yourself just to preserve it isn't a connection. It's a trap. And somewhere deep down, you already know this. You can feel the difference between who you are when they're near and who you are when they're not. One version is quiet, cautious, calculating. The other breathes. You know which one is real. So ask yourself, why do you keep choosing the version of you that disappears? The answer isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's conditioning, being taught that discomfort equals loyalty, that love is sacrifice, that staying through suffering is noble. But endurance is not always virtue. Sometimes it's fear, wearing the disguise of patience. And if you're staying just to avoid being alone, understand this. Being alone with your peace is better than being partnered with your pain. Peace isn't perfection. It's presence. It's being able to sit beside someone without guarding your breath and feel your shoulders soften, your breath slow down, your thoughts become clear. That kind of peace doesn't exhaust you. It restores you. It doesn't make you question yourself. It makes you feel safe enough to show all of who you are. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free," and sometimes bravery is quiet. It doesn't always look like confrontation. It doesn't always look like dramatic exits or slammed doors. Sometimes bravery is a whisper. I deserve better than this constant tension. Sometimes bravery is choosing to protect your peace instead of protecting someone else's comfort. It's walking away, not because they were the worst, but because staying kept you from becoming your best. No one should hold that kind of power over your peace. Not someone you love, not someone who claims they love you. You teach people how to treat you, not through what you demand, but through what you tolerate. Every time you silence your discomfort, just to keep things steady, you send a message. My peace is negotiable, but it isn't. At least, it shouldn't be. The cost of staying isn't just the arguments, the silence, the pressure. The cost is the version of you who never fully breathes again. That version fades quietly at first. Then suddenly you notice it. When laughter feels unfamiliar, when solitude feels more nourishing than company, when you start imagining a life where you're not constantly bracing for impact. This isn't drama. This is honesty. How much of yourself are you losing just to keep the illusion alive? How much energy are you spending trying to stay calm when you should be feeling seen? Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of alignment. It's when who you are, what you need, and what your relationship gives you exist in the same space. Anything less may feel familiar, but it isn't love. Not the kind that lasts. Not the kind that heals. Epictetus once said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And the first step to mastering yourself is protecting the energy that sustains you. If love cost you your peace, you're not gaining a partner. You're losing your foundation. And eventually, no matter how deep the connection feels, it will collapse under the weight of everything you've been holding back just to keep it alive. You can love someone deeply and still choose distance. You can miss someone terribly and still walk away. Because sometimes loving yourself looks like leaving, and peace The kind that doesn't tremble when you speak. The kind that doesn't disappear when they enter the room. That isn't optional. That's survival. And it's the one thing you should never surrender, no matter who you're trying to hold on to. One of the hardest truths to face is not that they didn't become who you needed, but that they were never going to. You weren't in love with the person in front of you. You were in love with the version of them you built in your mind, the version who apologized first, the version who understood your silences, the version who did the inner work, and finally met you halfway. But that version doesn't live here. That version exists in your imagination, stitched together from hope, memory, and the deep ache of unmet needs. And hope, as beautiful as it is, can become dangerous when it blinds you to reality, when it keeps you clinging to possibility instead of choosing what is. There's no shame in wanting someone to grow, but when their growth becomes the condition for your peace, you're no longer loving them, you're surviving them. Potential is seductive. It lets you rewrite the story into something softer than what you're living. It convinces you that this tension, this confusion, this repeated disappointment is temporary, that it's all leading somewhere better if you just hold on a little longer. But eventually, you have to face it. You're not holding on to love. You're holding on to a fantasy. And fantasies don't offer reciprocity. They offer longing. They offer overthinking. They offer the constant weight of waiting for someone to catch up to the version of them you already prepared space for. But no one asked you to make that space. You did that. And you keep doing it at your own expense. It's easy to confuse love with healing, to look at someone's wounds and see your own reflection. Maybe you know what it feels like to be misunderstood. Maybe you've been dismissed, overlooked, underestimated. And so when you see them struggling, you empathize. You want to believe that with enough patience, enough kindness, enough effort, they'll transform. But what if the person you're trying to save is actually yourself? Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And sometimes what we call fate, a connection we can't walk away from, a person we can't stop thinking about, is really a wound replaying itself. We project our pain onto someone else. Then we try to fix them, hoping it will heal us. But that isn't love. That's reenactment. And reenactments rarely end in resolution. There's nothing wrong with seeing potential in someone. But it becomes dangerous when that vision overshadows the truth. When we begin tolerating disrespect, inconsistency, or emotional neglect in the name of who they might become, something inside us shifts. You start justifying their behavior, not by comparing it to your needs, but by comparing it to their worst moments. You say things like, they didn't mean it. They're going through a lot. It's just a phase. But what if it isn't a phase? What if this is who they are? What if the transformation you're waiting for is never coming? The longer you postpone that question, the deeper the denial roots itself. You don't need to hate them to walk away. You just need to love yourself enough to stop living in a one-sided story. You slowly teach yourself how to suffer quietly, how to normalize discomfort, how to rename emotional inconsistency as complexity. And the longer you remain, the more you forget what it feels like to be met fully, to be heard without over-explaining, to be held without conditions. Potential doesn't hold you. It doesn't show up during hard conversations. It doesn't call you back after a painful fight. Potential is passive. It waits while you do the exhausting work of staying hopeful. And one day you wake up drained, not because the relationship ended, but because you spent so long trying to make it finally begin. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." But when your thoughts revolve around who someone could become, your life turns into a waiting room, a place where you constantly rearrange your boundaries, your expectations, your truth, just to remain seated. But you were never meant to wait endlessly for someone to grow into what you need. You were meant to live, to be loved in real time, not in theory. You were meant to build something with someone who meets you where you are, not someone who keeps you chasing the version of them you wish existed. Hope is not a strategy. Love is not a rehabilitation center. And healing is not something you can do on someone else's behalf, no matter how deeply you care. People don't change because you believe in them. They change because they believe in themselves. And if they don't, no amount of waiting, loving, or sacrificing will create that shift. Let them be who they are, but don't lose who you are in the process. Because when you love potential more than reality, you don't just lose time. You lose clarity. You lose energy. You lose the version of yourself who once knew what it felt like to be chosen, not merely tolerated. Walking away doesn't mean you gave up on them. It means you stopped abandoning yourself. It means you finally saw that the future you were holding on to only existed in your mind. And no matter how vivid that vision was, no matter how desperately you wanted it to be true, you cannot build a life with a dream. You can only choose what is real. And reality, when chosen fully, can be far more beautiful than the fiction we fight to preserve. Especially when it includes peace, presence, and a love that doesn't require suffering to prove it's alive. Not all pain announces itself with shouting matches or slammed doors. Sometimes the most unbearable pain is the quiet one, the one that hides in plain sight. It settles into the spaces where conversation once lived, where affection once flowed without effort. You sit across from them at dinner. The air feels heavy with everything unsaid. You ask how their day was, not because you're deeply curious anymore, but because silence feels too awkward to ignore. They answer with a distant, "Fine." You nod. You smile. You keep chewing, pretending the food tastes like something other than emotional numbness. There's no fight left to have. No argument left to solve. Just the thick, suffocating stillness of two people who have quietly stopped trying. And that's what makes it harder to leave, when nothing obvious is breaking, but everything inside you already has. That silence erodes you slowly. It doesn't shout. It whispers. Whispers things you don't want to hear, like how you don't feel seen anymore, how your presence feels like background noise, how you've been pouring energy into something that hasn't reflected warmth back in a very long time. And still, you tell yourself it's just a phase. You tell yourself that maybe every long-term relationship reaches this point, that maybe the spark always fades with time. But deep down, you know, this isn't about time. It isn't about routine. It's about emotional distance. The kind that feels like a canyon, stretching between two people who once couldn't go a single day without sharing everything. Now you hesitate before speaking. You question whether your words will even land. And when they don't, you start wondering if you should have stayed silent too. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being with someone who no longer notices you. It's different from being single. When you're alone, your silence belongs to you. It's peaceful. It's yours to shape, to fill, or to simply sit inside. But when you're sitting beside someone who once knew the depth of your thoughts and now barely asks how you are, that silence becomes unbearable because it reminds you of what once was and what may never return. So you keep showing up emotionally underfed, spiritually dimmed, hoping that one day they'll look at you and truly see you again. But people don't always come back. Sometimes they leave, without physically leaving, and you're the one carrying the weight of a goodbye that was never spoken out loud. You begin to doubt your instincts. You ask yourself, if you're expecting too much, maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe this is just how love matures. Quiet, steady, uneventful. But love is not meant to feel like tolerance. It's not supposed to make you feel like a burden. You shouldn't have to beg for eye contact. You shouldn't feel lucky just because they asked about your day. That isn't emotional maturity. That's emotional starvation. When the small gestures that were once effortless start feeling like rare acts of generosity, something isn't growing, something is fading, and you can feel it. Each day becomes a little colder, a little quieter, a little less alive. And in that quiet, you begin disappearing, piece by piece, smile by forced smile. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. That's the ache you carry. Not that no one is beside you, but that no one is truly with you. The kind of loneliness where you have a thought, a feeling, a realization, and you turn to share it, only to recognize the person you're sharing your life with isn't listening, or worse, doesn't care. That isn't partnership. That's proximity. And proximity without presence feels like rejection, repeated quietly. You don't need someone to simply fill the room. You need someone who fills the space between your soul and your skin with understanding, not just physical closeness, but emotional presence. Sometimes we stay because there's no explosion, no betrayal, no dramatic ending, nothing obviously broken enough to justify leaving. But that mindset keeps people trapped in emotional purgatory for years. You don't have to wait for visible damage to validate invisible pain. Emotional neglect is still neglect. Silence, when used to avoid, is still a form of abandonment. When you stop expressing your needs because you're tired of blank stares, that isn't acceptance, it's resignation. And if you constantly have to convince yourself that this is normal, that this is enough, it probably isn't. We weren't created to live in constant compromise with our own emotional well-being. Eventually, the silence doesn't just sit between you and them, it settles inside you. You stop journaling, you stop dreaming, you stop reaching, because somewhere deep within, you decided it's safer to expect less, to need less, to hope for nothing, so nothing can wound you. But apathy is not peace, and emotional numbness is not the same as healing. When you stay quiet for too long, silence becomes your language. You begin forgetting how to speak your truth. And even if someone finally asked, "What's wrong?" you might not know how to answer anymore. Because when no one asks for so long, you start believing you no longer matter. Seneca once said, "A sword never kills anybody. It is a tool in the killer's hand." Silence can be a tool too. It can be used to avoid, to manipulate, to punish. But it can also awaken. The silence you're experiencing may not be the end of the relationship. It may be the beginning of your awareness, the realization that connection doesn't collapse overnight. It fades slowly, through days of unspoken pain, through needs that go unmet, through conversations that feel like duty instead of desire. And that awareness, uncomfortable as it is, might be the very thing that saves you. Because the first step out of numbness is naming what's missing. It's saying, "This silence isn't peace. It's pain. I haven't been allowed to speak." So where does that leave you? maybe still at the table, still in the room, still wearing a smile that doesn't quite reach your eyes. But now you carry something different, awareness. And with awareness comes choice, not a command to leave, not a script to follow, just a gentle, powerful reminder. Your emotions are not too much. Your longing for connection is valid. Your voice, no matter how quiet it has become, still matters. You don't need an explosion to justify walking away. Sometimes the absence of sound is reason enough. And the decision to leave doesn't always arrive with fire. Sometimes it arrives in stillness, in the calm certainty that you deserve more than to be slowly erased by someone who once promised to see you. You deserve to be met, not merely endured. And if silence is all they offer, it's okay to become the one who finally speaks for yourself. It always starts with good intentions. You tell yourself you're being kind, that love means staying for someone, no matter how long it takes them to get it together. You convince yourself you're the steady one, the patient one, the one strong enough to handle their chaos, because you see their potential buried beneath the wreckage. So you stay. You explain gently, again and again. You excuse their outbursts, soften the edges of their neglect, swallow your hurt, just to keep them from feeling guilty. You call it love. You call it strength. But strength is not ignoring your own needs. And love does not require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Somewhere along the way, what began as support turns into supervision. You become the one tracking their moods, anticipating their triggers, adjusting your tone so they don't shut down, editing your words so they don't spiral. You're no longer just loving them, you're managing them. And that kind of emotional labor is exhausting in a way no one else sees. It doesn't explode, it erodes, slowly, quietly, and piece by piece. You start losing the parts of yourself that once felt whole. Your joy grows softer, your spark dims, your peace becomes conditional, not based on how you feel, but on how they feel. Doing. You don't notice it at first, but your well-being has slowly become tied to their unpredictability. And that isn't love, that's survival. When you start confusing control with care, the line between helping someone and trying to save them begins to blur. You tell yourself, if I love them deeply enough, they'll finally understand. If I show up every time they fall apart, eventually they'll stop breaking everything. But it rarely unfolds that way. Real change doesn't come from being rescued. It comes from taking responsibility. And when you constantly rescue someone from the consequences of their own behavior, you don't just protect them from pain. You protect them from growth. You shield them from truth. And in doing that, you also shield yourself from the fear that if you stop holding everything together, the entire relationship might collapse. Sometimes we don't want them to fall, not because we think they can't handle it, but because we're afraid of what their fall will mean for us, that we'll be alone, that we'll have to admit it's over, that we'll lose the story we've been telling ourselves about what this could become. So we step into the role of fixer. We become the planner, the reminder, the emotional regulator. We call it loyalty, but often it's fear wearing a softer name. Carl Jung once said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but it can be just as terrifying to accept someone else as they are, especially when they refuse to meet you halfway. So instead of acceptance, we choose illusion. We choose control. We rename it love. But love does not require that you become a healer. It does not demand that you carry the entire emotional weight of a relationship on your shoulders. That isn't devotion. That's imbalance. And imbalance even when wrapped in good intentions, becomes manipulation. Not cruel, not obvious, but quiet. You gently push them toward clarity, telling yourself you're encouraging growth. You silence your real feelings to keep the peace, telling yourself you're being mature. You shapeshift into someone more digestible, more careful, more endlessly tolerant. You call it support, but what you're really doing is managing, curating, controlling, all because a part of you believes that if you don't hold it together, no one will. There's a voice inside you that says love is supposed to be hard, that real relationships require sacrifice. And yes, all love requires effort, but effort should never cost you your truth. If you're constantly analyzing your behavior, while they remain unaware of theirs, you're not evolving together. You're shrinking, so they don't feel insecure. You're making yourself small enough to avoid touching their wounds, and eventually, you stop recognizing yourself. You become the person who stays quiet during arguments, who walks on eggshells, even in moments of calm, who mistakes emotional labor for intimacy. But that isn't love. That's burnout, dressed up as commitment. You don't owe anyone your emotional oxygen. You don't need to earn your place by being the most tolerant, the most understanding, the most endlessly forgiving. Love should not feel like endurance, and care should never mean control. True love meets you in the middle. It doesn't need to be managed. It needs to be felt, openly, honestly, freely. If you are constantly orchestrating their healing while neglecting your own, that isn't support. It's self-abandonment. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back, not to punish them, not to prove a point, but to remind yourself you are not their savior. You are not responsible for regulating their emotions. You are allowed to stop trying to repair what was never yours to fix. You are allowed to choose rest over repair. And most importantly, you are allowed to desire a relationship where love flows naturally without needing to be managed at every moment. Epictetus once said, "People are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them." And sometimes, the view we take of our role in someone else's life is exactly what keeps us trapped. You think your love will be the turning point. You believe your care will finally be the bridge that pulls them through. You tell yourself that if you just hold on a little longer, give a little more, understand a little deeper, something will shift. But the truth is this: you can only meet people as deeply as they are willing to meet themselves. And if they refuse to face their own chaos, no amount of support will rewrite that story. Not your kindness, not your sacrifices, not even the purest love you carry in your chest. Here's the quiet truth we rarely say out loud. If love needs constant control just to survive, it's no longer love. It becomes obligation. It becomes fear. It becomes a cycle that keeps spinning, as long as you're willing to be the engine. And one day, you won't just feel tired of them. You'll feel tired of yourself. Tired of proving your love through silence, through effort, through endurance. That's when something inside you shifts. That's when you stop confusing control with care, and you begin remembering what it feels like to simply be loved, not managed, seen, not supervised, held, not handled. That difference, that's freedom. You can hand someone the sun and they'll still complain the light is too bright. You can pour your heart into every crack they carry, believing your warmth will mend what life fractured, and still watch them crumble under the weight of their own choices. That's the hardest reality when you love someone who refuses to grow. It doesn't matter how patient you are, how present, how gentle. Growth is an inside decision. You can be the most nurturing presence